The tray fell first. Then the silence. Amara Adeyemi stood frozen in the hospital corridor. Surgical instruments scattered across the floor like broken promises. 40 staff members, doctors, nurses, interns stared in stunned silence as her husband's voice echoed off the walls. "You heard me," Dr. Kong Duyun said coldly, the same tone he used in surgery. "You're done here, Amara. Turn in your badge." A heart monitor beeped steadily down the hall, indifferent. Amara's hands trembled not with fear, but with cold recognition. This was the moment she'd been quietly preparing for. If you're watching from anywhere in the world right now, drop your country in the comments. And if you love stories about people who mistake kindness for weekends, subscribe. Because what happens next will change everything. 6 months earlier, nobody at Grace Horizon Medical Center knew Amara's last name carried any weight beyond the one stitched onto her scrub top. She'd requested the night shift in intake, the unglamorous post nobody fought for, the one where you processed frightened patients and irritated insurance calls instead of standing in an operating room. She wore flat shoes. She skipped the executive parking. She ate lunch alone at a corner table by the vending machines. And when anyone asked why a woman with her composure and education worked such a modest position, she simply said she liked being close to patients. What she never said was that Grace Horizon Medical Center existed because her grandmother, Adiz Adeyemi, had sold the last parcel of family land in Enugu 40 years ago and funneled every coin into a struggling clinic in the United States that no one believed in. What she never said was that after her grandmother passed, and after her own father lost himself to grief and bad investments, Amara had quietly rebuilt the family trust from nothing, brick by brick, deal by deal, until the modest clinic her grandmother funded had grown into one of the most respected private hospital systems on the East Coast, and she owned 83% of it. She had never told her husband any of this. Not because she didn't trust him. Because, in the beginning, she wanted to be loved for herself, not for what she controlled. And somewhere between the wedding in Lagos and the quiet apartment they shared in the city, that reasonable caution had curdled into something else, a secret so large it had begun to feel like a wall between them, brick by silent brick. Kong Duyun had married her 3 years ago in a small ceremony. Neither of their families fully understood his conservative soul relatives, skeptical of an outsider. Her Nigerian aunties whispering about a foreign son-in-law who barely smiled. But Amara had seen something in him nobody else did. A man terrified of being ordinary, driven by a need to prove himself worthy of a legacy his own father never let him forget. He was brilliant, meticulous, ruthlessly disciplined. And lately, someone Amara barely recognized. Because in the past year, Duyun had climbed faster than anyone expected, from senior physician to deputy chief of operations at Grace Horizon, a hospital he did not know his wife secretly owned. He worked 18-hour days. He came home distracted, sometimes cold, sometimes not at all. And when Amara gently asked what was wrong, he would only say, "You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under." As if her quiet hospital job made her incapable of understanding pressure at all. She let him believe it. That was her mistake. The morning everything cracked open began ordinarily enough. Amara arrived at 6 a.m., signed in at intake, and noticed something strange in the East Wing, a moving crew loading boxes out of the pediatric wing archive room, boxes marked with a logo she didn't recognize. When she asked a passing administrator what was happening, the woman lowered her voice and said, "Didn't you hear? We're being sold. Greyridge Capital is finalizing the acquisition by end of quarter. Dr. Kang's leading the transition." Amara's stomach dropped. Grace Horizon wasn't for sale. She hadn't authorized a sale. She hadn't even been consulted. She spent the next 3 hours pulling threads quietly, the way she'd learned to from years of boardroom battles she never brought home. What she found chilled her. Someone inside the hospital had been feeding Greyridge Capital internal financials for months, projected losses that didn't exist, inflated liabilities, a manufactured narrative designed to convince the minority shareholders that the hospital was drowning and needed to sell fast, cheap, and quiet. And the digital trail, however carefully disguised, kept circling back to one login. D. Kong. She told herself there had to be an explanation. Dune was ambitious, yes, but not a thief. Not someone who would burn down the one thing her family had bled for. She needed to hear it from him directly, Needed to give him the chance to explain before she let suspicion calcify into certainty. She found him in his office that evening, jacket off, tie loosened, staring at his laptop with the particular stillness of a man calculating odds. Do-yoon. He closed the door. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He looked up, something flickering behind his eyes before the mask came down. Not now, Amara. I have a call in 10 minutes. Is the hospital being sold? His jaw tightened. For a second, just a second, she saw something close to panic. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful, condescending calm he used on junior staff. That's above your pay grade. Why are you even asking about acquisitions? You work in intake. Answer the question. It's complicated financial strategy, you wouldn't. Don't. Her voice cracked, sharper than she intended. Don't tell me what I would or wouldn't understand. Not tonight. He stood, circling the desk, and for a moment she thought he might finally tell her the truth. Instead he said, quietly, almost gently, in the tone of a man delivering bad news to someone he pitied. Amara, I love you, but you need to trust that the people running this hospital know what they're doing. This isn't your world. 3 words. This isn't your world. Words that would come back to haunt him in ways he could not yet imagine. If this story is already pulling something out of you, that ache of being underestimated by the very person who should know your worth best, type it in the comments below. And give this video a like if you've ever had to sit in silence while someone doubted you completely. The next morning, the humiliation came in public, in front of everyone, as if Do-yoon needed an audience to prove a point Amara never asked him to make. It started with a misfiled form. A minor clerical error in patient intake, the kind that happened weekly and was corrected without drama. But that morning, Do-yoon was already unraveling. Greyridge's lawyers were pressing for final signatures. The fabricated numbers were beginning to attract real scrutiny from the board. And somewhere in his mind, firing the one person who kept asking uncomfortable questions must have felt like control. He found her at the intake desk, snatched the folder from her hands, and in front of 2 doctors, 3 nurses, a security guard, and a line of waiting patients, he said the words that would detonate everything. This is exactly why I said you don't belong in decisions above your station. You can't even manage basic paperwork. You're done here, Amara. Turn in your badge. The corridor went silent. Someone's pen stopped clicking. A patient's wheelchair squeaked to a halt. Amara looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw not the ambitious man she married, but someone drowning in his own fabricated crisis, drowning and reaching for the nearest thing to drag under with him. Or, she could have told him then. Could have said the 4 words that would have ended his tirade instantly. I own this hospital. But something in her refused to hand him that mercy in front of an audience he'd chosen to humiliate her before. If he wanted to fire her, he could fire her the way he thought the world worked and then watch what happened next. She unclipped her badge, set it gently on the counter, and said only, "Understood, Dr. Kong." Then she walked out through the sliding doors into the grey morning, past the ambulance bay, past the flower cart she'd once had installed for grieving families, and did not look back. Behind her, whispers erupted. A senior nurse named Priscilla, who had worked intake for 11 years and adored Amara, turned to a colleague and murmured, "That man has no idea what he just did." She wasn't wrong. But even Priscilla didn't know the full truth yet. By the time Amara reached her car, her phone was already buzzing, not from Do-yoon, but from her family attorney, a sharp, unshakable woman named Renata Osei, who had handled the AMBW trust for a decade. "Amara," Renata said the moment the call connected, "we need to talk about Greyridge Capital. And we need to talk about your husband." Amara sat in the driver's seat, engine off, hands folded tight in her lap. "Tell me." The forensic audit came back overnight. The losses Greyridge based their lowball offer on were fabricated, deliberately inflated liabilities, hidden receivables, falsified projections. Someone rewired the numbers to make Grace Horizon look like it was bleeding out, so the board would panic and approve a fire sale acquisition at a fraction of true value. And Do-yoon was. His login authorized 3 of the 4 altered reports. "Amara, I need to ask you something delicate. Do you think your husband knew whose hospital he was gutting?" Amara closed her eyes. No, she whispered. I don't think he had any idea at all. That single sentence held more heartbreak than any confrontation could. Because in that moment, Amara understood two truths simultaneously. Her husband had betrayed the hospital that fed thousands of families, and he had done it without even knowing he was betraying his own wife. Which was worse, she couldn't say. Maybe both were the same wound wearing different faces. If you've ever discovered someone you loved was capable of something you never imagined, let this next part sit with you because Amara wasn't finished. Like this video if this story has your heart racing, and stay with us, because what happens in the boardroom 2 days later will change the entire balance of power. Renata scheduled an emergency session with the board for Thursday morning 3 days after Amara's public firing, and 1 day before Greyridge's acquisition papers were set to be finalized. Amara spent those 3 days doing something she hadn't done in years, preparing not as a wife, not as an intake clerk, but as the majority shareholder of a $140 million hospital system. She pulled the original incorporation documents her grandmother had signed in a cramped Enugu law office in 1984. She pulled the trust paperwork bearing her own signature, dated the week she turned 26, the week she'd quietly assumed control after her father's decline. She pulled bank records, voting shares, board bylaws, the entire skeleton of the empire she had built in silence while wearing scrubs and eating lunch alone by the vending machines. And she pulled the forensic audit naming her husband. Duyun, meanwhile, spent those same 3 days unraveling in a different direction. He called Amara 11 times. She didn't answer once. He showed up at their apartment on the second night, pounding on a door she'd quietly had the locks changed on, shouting apologies through the wood that sounded less like remorse and more like panic that his wife had disappeared right as his carefully built career began collapsing beneath him. Amara, please, he said to the door, voice raw. I don't know what happened at the hospital. Numbers keep appearing that I never authorized. Everyone's looking at me like I did something. Need you. Please. She stood on the other side, hand pressed flat against the wood, throat tight, and said nothing. Because she believed him, she believed he hadn't consciously falsified those documents, but belief wasn't the same as forgiveness for the words he chose to humiliate her with, in a hallway, in front of 40 witnesses, over a hospital he never knew was hers to lose. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. The Grace Horizon boardroom sat on the top floor, glass walls overlooking the city, 12 chairs around a mahogany table that had seen a decade of decisions Amara authorized from behind closed doors, while everyone assumed the money came from an anonymous family trust with no living face attached to it. Duyun walked in expecting a routine finance meeting to finalize the Greyridge sale. Instead, he found the room already full. The board of directors, Renata Osei seated with a folder 3 inches thick, and at the head of the table, in a charcoal suit instead of scrubs, hair pulled back with quiet authority, sat his wife. He stopped in the doorway. Amara. What are you doing here? Sit down, Duyun, said the board chairman, an older man named Franklin Whitmore who had known Amara's family for 15 years. Mrs. Kong has the floor. The blood drained from Duyun's face as the pieces began assembling themselves in real time. Mrs. Kong, he repeated, hollow. You're on the board. I'm the majority shareholder, Amara said, voice level, unshaken. 83% of Grace Horizon Medical Center belongs to the Adeyemi Family Trust. I've held controlling interests since I was 26 years old. This hospital exists because my grandmother sold the last piece of land she owned to fund it. I have worked in this building for 2 years in scrubs in the intake department, watching how the people I trusted to run it actually treated the patients and each other when they didn't think ownership was watching. Duyun's mouth opened, closed. You let me think. I let you love me without a price tag attached, Amara said, and for the first time her voice wavered, just slightly, the only crack in an otherwise unbreakable delivery. I wanted to be your wife, not your benefactor. That was my choice, and maybe it was the wrong one. But you made choices too, Duyun. You authorized falsified financial reports that would have sold this hospital, my grandmother's hospital, to Greyridge Capital for a fraction of its worth. And 3 days ago, in a public hallway, in front of 40 members of staff, you fired me from a job in a building I own, over a filing error, because you decided I didn't belong in decisions above my station. The room was utterly silent. Somewhere outside the glass wall, the city hummed on, indifferent. I didn't authorize those reports, Duyun said, quieter now, desperate. I don't know how my login. I believe you, Amara said, and watched confusion flicker across his face at the unexpected mercy. The forensic audit shows a secondary access point used your credentials without your direct action 3 nights running someone with administrative clearance and motive. I have a theory about who. But that's a separate conversation from what you said to me in that hallway, which had nothing to do with any audit and everything to do with how little you thought of the woman standing across from you. Renata slid a folder toward the center of the table. The acquisition is officially dead, she said. Mrs. Kong has exercised her shareholder authority to block the sale, pending full investigation into the falsified reports. If you felt that chill just now the moment someone underestimated finally reveals exactly who they are, comment the word reveal below. And if you're rooting for Amara right now, hit that like button because we are not done. There's a name behind that falsified data, and it isn't the one everyone assumed. The investigation moved fast once Amara's full authority was on the table. Forensic auditors traced the secondary access point. Renata had flagged an administrative override used at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and 4 a.m. across 3 separate nights, always routed through Duyun's credentials but originating from a workstation 2 floors away from his office. The workstation belonged to Vanessa Cho, Grace Horizon's Director of Business Development, the woman who had personally championed the Greyridge deal from its earliest whispers, the woman who had sat 2 seats down from Duyun in every strategy meeting for the past 8 months, smiling, nodding, feeding him numbers she claimed came from finance. Vanessa had a history nobody bothered to check closely 3 years earlier, at a different hospital system. She'd been quietly let go after a similar acquisition scandal, the details buried under an NDA and a generous severance that bought her silence and a clean-looking resume. She'd learned from her first attempt. This time, she made sure someone else's login carried the weight if anyone came looking. Duyun, it turned out, had trusted her completely, had, in fact, been so consumed with proving his worth to a board he didn't realize his own wife controlled, that he'd stopped double-checking numbers Vanessa handed him, stopped asking why a business development director had access to financial modeling that should have gone through his office first. His ambition hadn't made him a criminal. It had made him careless and cowardly, and cruel in the specific way people become when they're terrified of not being enough. When confronted, Vanessa didn't deny it so much as sneer through the confession. You people, she said to the investigators, gesturing vaguely, you build these little empires and act shocked when someone smarter finds a way in. Duyun made it easy. He wanted this promotion so badly he never once asked why I was so eager to hand it to him. Duyun sat through her statement in a side room, listening through a one-way intercom Renata had arranged, and Amara watched something in him break, not the ego this time, but something more honest underneath it. He'd built his entire self-worth on being indispensable, on climbing higher than his father ever believed he could, and in that climb he'd made himself blind to the person orchestrating his downfall, and cruel to the one person who might have caught it sooner, if he'd simply trusted her enough to talk to her like an equal. That evening, he found Amara alone in the hospital chapel, a small, quiet room she'd had built years ago and rarely told anyone she funded, tucked behind the pediatric ward for frightened families who needed somewhere to sit with their fear. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before she acknowledged him. I don't know how to start, he admitted. Then don't start with an excuse, Amara said, not unkindly. Start with what you actually feel. He sat 2 pews away, hands clasped between his knees, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, he spoke without performance. I was so afraid of being ordinary that I stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as one more thing I needed to manage, to fix, to keep in a box labeled, not my problem right now. And when the numbers started slipping and I felt everything I'd built shaking, I didn't reach for you. I reached for control, and you were the easiest person to grab it from, because I told myself your world was smaller than mine. His voice cracked. It wasn't smaller. It was bigger than I ever imagined, and I was too busy protecting my own ego to notice. Amara let the silence hold for a moment before answering. You didn't just embarrass me in that hallway, Duyun. You confirmed something I'd been quietly afraid of since the day we married, that if you knew the truth about who I was, you'd either resent me for it or use it. I hid myself so completely that I never gave you the chance to prove me wrong, and you never gave yourself the humility to ask the right questions. We did this to each other. If this moment is hitting you the way it's hitting us, take a second and comment your thoughts below. Has someone you loved ever underestimated you completely? And how did you find your way back, together or apart? And if this story is earning it, tap that like button right now. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Amara did not simply forgive and restore Do-yoon to his position out of sentimentality. She was, after all, still the majority shareholder of a hospital he had nearly helped sell out from under 3,000 employees and countless patients. The board voted, at her recommendation, to place him on a 6-month probationary review, stripped of acquisition authority, required to report directly to an oversight committee for every major decision. It was, everyone agreed, more mercy than most executives received after a scandal of that scale, mercy that existed only because his wife chose to extend it, quietly, without ever making a public spectacle of her generosity the way he had made a public spectacle of his cruelty. Vanessa Cho was terminated immediately and referred for criminal fraud charges, her carefully rebuilt reputation collapsing for a second time, this time with no quiet NDA waiting to catch her. Amara did not return to the intake desk. She stepped, finally and fully, into the role she'd spent 2 years avoiding, chair of the board, visible now, no longer hiding behind flat shoes and a modest badge. On her first official day in that capacity, she walked the same corridor where Do-yoon had fired her, and this time every nurse, every doctor, every intern who had witnessed her humiliation watched her walk past with something closer to reverence than pity. Priscilla, the senior nurse who'd predicted disaster the very morning it happened, stopped her near the flower cart. "I always knew there was more to you," she said, smiling. "I just didn't know it was this much more." Amara laughed, a real laugh, the first one in weeks. "Neither did I some days." As for her marriage, she and Do-yoon chose, slowly and without guarantee, to try. Not because the wound had vanished, but because both of them, in their separate and painful ways, had finally been forced to see each other clearly, not as roles, not as titles, not as a hospital administrator and a quiet intake clerk, but as two people who had let fear build walls where honesty should have lived instead. He began attending therapy, alone at first, then together with Amara, slowly relearning how to ask questions instead of assuming answers. She, in turn, began telling him things she'd never told another living soul about her grandmother's sacrifice, about the loneliness of carrying an empire in silence, about how exhausting it had been to love someone while wondering if that love would survive the truth. It was not instant. It was not easy. But 6 months later, standing together at the hospital's new wing dedication, a pediatric center Amara had personally funded in her grandmother's name, Do-yoon took the microphone before the assembled press and staff and said something he never would have said the man he was a year earlier. "I once told my wife this wasn't her world," he said, voice steady despite the visible emotion beneath it. "I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. This hospital, this legacy, this entire world, it was always hers. I'm just grateful she let me back into it." Before we close tonight, if this story reminded you that true worth is never loud, never announced, and never needs anyone's permission to exist, comment the biggest lesson you're taking from Amara's story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because we have so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Somewhere beyond the glass windows of Grace Horizon Medical Center, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet reckoning that had happened within those walls. But inside, everyone who witnessed it understood something they would carry long after the headlines faded, that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding everything up. And the day you finally see them clearly is the day you realize how much you nearly lost by looking away.